The headless horseman rides tonight through stark and starless skies, shattering the silence with his otherworldly cries. He races through the darkness on his alabaster steed. The headless horseman rides tonight wherever the fates would lead. And he rides upon the wind tonight, he rides upon the wind. Galloping, galloping, galloping on, out of the great oblivion. Galloping till the night is gone, he rides upon the wind tonight, he rides upon the wind. The headless horseman rides tonight, he rides the wind alone. Beneath his arm he tightly tucks his head of gleaming bone. His voice is harsh and hollow, it is horrible to hear. The headless horseman rides tonight to fill the earth with fear. And he rides upon the wind tonight, he rides upon the wind. Galloping, galloping, galloping on, out of the great oblivion. Galloping till the night is gone, he rides upon the wind tonight, he rides upon the wind. So proceeds the first two stanzas and the refrain of Jack Prelutsky's children's poem, yes, it's a children's poem, called The Headless Horseman Rides Tonight, which can be found in an anthology written by the same author by the same name. Despite its canonical establishment as a likely practical joke by Brom Bones in Washington Irving's fiction The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, The Headless Horseman has become a folk horror icon. Indeed, there's fascinating symbolism in that monster. A horseman, after all, is a symbol of authority or might, and a headless person is someone that you cannot reason with. When someone loses their head, as we say, they can no longer be talked to or consulted about their reasons for doing things. The headless horseman, therefore, represents a kind of authority or strength that you cannot reason with. In this respect, the headless horseman resembles death itself, another power that you can't really reason with, and which in mytho-historical contexts has been depicted as a horseman. No wonder that Jack Prelutsky's version of the Headless Horseman, illustrated by Arnold Lobel, resembles the Grim Reaper. It's a comparison that we'll embellish too in today's adventure. Welcome to PhD&D, everyone. I'm Dr. Bowers, and today we're going to talk about the Writer's Bridge, a Ravenloft Domain of Dread, which goes back to the old 2nd edition of Dungeons & Dragons, and which reappears in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. As with my other Ravenloft videos, we're going to talk about what this domain is, list some media that'll help you get an imaginative grip on that domain, and then sketch out an adventure. In our case, the adventure will take PCs from levels 8 through level 10, that is to say, they will complete the adventure at level 10, and then with DM's permission level up to 11 at the very end, across 3 acts. So, to get started, what is the Writer's Bridge? Well, nearly every domain knows some version of the apparition called the Headless Rider. It appears as a mercenary in dark armor in Mordant, a ghostly cataphract in Har Akir, and a mutated centaur in Lamordia. But in each incarnation, certain details remain true. The rider is missing its head, it appears upon a prominent bridge, and it decapitates victims as it endlessly searches for its own head. Should someone escape an encounter with a headless rider, they might find a different domain on the opposite side of the Spirit's Bridge. The Writer's Bridge is a captivating domain, pun intended, but it's a challenge to write an adventure for. This is because the entire domain is basically one encounter with the domain's Darklord. So, to help us expand the domain and get an imaginative grip on it, we're going to appeal to a variety of media. I've already mentioned the titular poem from Jack Prelutsky's children anthology, The Headless Horseman Rides Tonight, More Poems to Trouble Your Sleep. We're going to reincorporate its refrain into the very end of our adventure. More obvious than that, of course, is Washington Irving's 1820 story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which, at least in English, introduces readers to the figure of the Headless Horseman. Also, on the topic of headlessness, we're going to appeal to a very old folktale which you may have heard before. A tale about a woman who always wears a ribbon around her neck and refuses to take it off no matter how much anyone pleads or begs, and yet finally, at the end of her life, or sometime in it, she takes the ribbon off and her head falls off, and she dies. Interestingly enough, this tale was first rendered in English in 1824 by Washington Irving, in a story called The Adventures of the German Student. What's with Washington Irving and people's heads being removed? I don't know, someone could write an interesting book on that maybe. The same folktale was adapted at length in French by Alexandre Dumas, in a novel whose title translates as The Woman with the Velvet Collar. But I'm guessing that many of my viewers were first acquainted with this folktale in a children's book by Alvin Schwartz called In a Dark, Dark Room, where there's a tale called The Girl with the Green Ribbon. We're going to take elements of this narrative and put them in our adventure for a fun twist at the end. Now, in terms of contemporary renditions of that folktale, I have to mention two sources. The first is a 2014 short story by Carmen Maria Machado called The Husband Stitch. This is not only an excellent and horrifying retelling of that same folktale, but it has a lot more going on with it. If you're a fan of literature, and especially if you're interested in commentary on gender, patriarchy, gender norms, gender depression, mores concerning gender and sexuality, you've got to read this story. If you're only looking for a spooky story where someone loses their head and that's it, maybe you should skip this one. But if you like literature with all of its richness and symbolism, you've got to read this piece. This short story is featured in the 2017 collection by the author called Her Body and Other Parties, and I recommend that book as well. And speaking of anthologies, there's also a 2014 collection by Junji Ito called Fragments of Horror, or at least that's what it's translated as in English, and there's a story in there called Tomio, Red Turtleneck. And that is also a fun story about someone losing his head, and it's a variation on this same green ribbon folktale. I highly recommend it too, because it embellishes on the myth in the same way that we are going to incorporate in our adventure. Finally, there's the 2021 film The Green Knight, which not only plays with themes of decapitation, but which also features a fun encounter with a ghost who has lost her head. Her name is Winifred, an Easter egg referring to a decapitated Welsh saint, and we're going to take that encounter right out of that movie and just put it in our adventure. And finally, there are also two supplements from the second edition of D&D version of Ravenloft. The first is the 1992 supplement called Darklords, which features a sketch of the Headless Horseman and his domain. I found this supplement to be a little weird because the way that they set it up, you're supposed to face the Headless Horseman first, and then face his minions. And I'm not sure what they were thinking. Maybe the Headless Horseman is supposed to come at you in multiple passes or something, but when you're reading it, you can't help but wonder, why would you fight the boss monster first, followed by the minions? It's rather weird, and a convention which we are not going to adopt, but if you're interested in the second edition roots of this attempt to make a domain out of the Headless Horseman, it's right there. I also recommend the 1993 adventure booklet, Melancholy Meetings, from the boxed set Castles Forlorn by Lisa Smedman. It features an encounter with a Death's Head tree, which is very spooky, and we're going to take elements of it and put it in our adventure. Okay, with media influences out of the way, let's sketch out this adventure. In Act 1, at level 8, the PCs find themselves traveling a wooded, mist-enshrouded road, which is so long that they cannot see its end either way. They come across an inn where the guests all wear protective metal neck scarves, and as a group of sword wraiths attack, the PCs soon find out why. The PCs leave the inn, taking a few scarves as gifts as well as a newfound ally, and then they proceed to Act 2 and level up to 9. In Act 2, at level 9, the PCs happen upon a cabin on the side of the road, which is next to a lake. Inside the cabin is a ghost who, despite initially appearing as a normal woman, asks the PCs to descend into the lake and retrieve her lost head. Assuming they do, they have not only won the ghost's gratitude with a good deed, but also some treasure and a place to stay the night. They level up to 10 and proceed to Act 3. In Act 3, at level 10, the PCs come across a horrific patch of forest featuring a pair of Death's Head trees that flank the road. As they fight, they hear the thunderous approach of hoofbeats. Soon enough, the Headless Rider appears to attack them, fights to the death, and should they survive, the PCs face a horrifying twist of fate. In terms of maps and monsters, this adventure takes elements from Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, Ghosts of Saltmarsh, Mordenkainen Presents Monsters of the Multiverse, and of course, Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. So let's dig into the details of this adventure. In Act 1, at level 8, the PCs find themselves traveling along a wooded, mist-flanked road which is so long that they cannot see its end in either direction. If the PCs attempt to stray from the road, either by walking to either side, or flying, or even burrowing, they're going to find themselves entering the Shadowfell mist, which will deposit them right where they came from, onto the road. It's a Ravenloft domain after all, that's what the mists do. For a map, I would use any of the community-made maps of Svalich Road for Curse of Strahd. You could just do an internet image search for Svalich Road maps, and you'll find a bunch of stuff which was lovingly created by the Curse of Strahd community. Just use a map of Svalich Road for this road. Eventually, the PCs come across a dreary-looking tavern with nothing else surrounding it. A sign hangs over the doorway that says, "The Witless Gibbet." Inside, about a dozen guests, all commoners, drink ales and tea amid silence and light conversation. They're all friendly to the PCs, but they all wear conspicuous protective neck scarves, which range in materials from studded leather up through outright chainmail. If asked about them, the commoners say that there's a need to protect your neck in this lands. After all, monsters are constantly trying to decapitate you. As soon as the PCs learn this, as if on cue, 4 sword wraiths arise from the floorboards or fly in through the walls to attack the PCs. The other guests are terrified and they go and hide, but the sword wraiths mostly focus their attacks on the PCs. Every single time they attack the PCs, the DM should describe how they're swiping at the PCs' necks specifically, as if they're trying to cut the PCs' heads off. Be very clear about this. "They're going for the throat! They're trying to cut your head off!" Say things like that. I don't think that we need any special mechanics for this, although if you want to add them, you could. I think that it's enough to just describe the monster's attacks as being focused on the neck. Now, the sword wraiths fight until they are defeated, and once they're defeated, the assembled guests thank the PCs for their heroism, and as a gesture of thanks, offer each of the PCs one of these protective neck scarves. DMs should tell players that if their PC wears this neck scarf, they get a +1 armor class bonus to any attack that's aimed at the PC's neck. And because so many attacks in this adventure are going to be aimed at the PC's necks, it seems likely that the players will accept these scarves without any sort of skepticism or criticism or hesitation. If they experiment with the scarves to test them and see whether they're safe, putting them on and taking them off and the like that, you should say that the scarves behave as normal objects. After all, the curse which is laid on them doesn't take effect until the Headless Rider has been slain. After the battle, the PCs are welcome to stay the night if they wish. If they do, they gain the benefits of a long rest, although they do suffer nightmares about being chased by a gaggle of floating disembodied heads, and they hear the thunder of hoofbeats in the distance. Now, whether the PCs stay the night or not at the Witless Gibbet, one of the guests, named Dennis, wants to come with the PCs. Like the other guests, and perhaps like the PCs themselves now, Dennis wears a protective neck scarf. I would make Dennis into a sidekick using whichever rules you prefer for sidekicks. It could be from Matt Colville's Strongholds and Followers, or it could be from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, whichever you prefer. But make Dennis into a sidekick who goes along with the PCs. We want Dennis to survive the entire adventure too, so try to protect him within reason. Let the monsters favor attacks against the PCs, etc. Now, once the PCs leave the inn, and the inn is out of their sight, they won't be able to find it again, no matter how far back on the road they go. The inn is just gone. Such is the nature of this domain. Dennis stays with them, although. At any rate, once the PCs have left, they level up to 9, and we proceed to Act 2. In Act 2, at level 9, the PCs happen across an abandoned cabin next to a lake. If they approach, they are attacked by 6 Varghouls who dive out of the misty canopy, attacking the PCs and fighting to the death. As a little bit of horror flavor, I would have the Varghouls cry out, "Help me! Help me! Help me!" as they attack the PCs with vicious aggression. Once the PCs have defeated these monsters, they find a woman inside the cabin who introduces herself as Winifred and asks the PCs for their help. Although she looks like a normal woman, she explains that she has lost her head at the bottom of the lake, and she asks the PCs to go down to the bottom of the lake and retrieve it. If the PCs point out that she has a head, she will insist that she doesn't, and if the PCs use any magic or class abilities or even a wisdom religion check to detect the undead, they will soon discover that Winifred is a kind of ghost. No, a ghost. The PCs won't be able to rest in the cabin until they placate Winifred. If they try to take a short rest or even a long rest, she will beseech them with pleas and won't let them rest a second. Now, for a map of the lake's bottom, I would use a map of the Cove Reef from Appendix A of Ghosts of Saltmarsh. Take away all of the scripted encounters that they've got in there. We don't need any of them, and in fact, a lot of those encounters really clash with the flavor of this adventure because they involve ocean seafaring and piracy and stuff like that. I would also remember to take into account the fact that this is underwater, so combat and survival should involve all of the dangers mentioned on page 198 of the player's handbook. Now, instead of any of the scripted encounters from Ghosts of Saltmarsh, I would just feature the skull at the bottom of the lake somewhere, clearly visible, but it's guarded by 3 or 4 drowned assassins. The statistics of these monsters are detailed in Ghosts of Saltmarsh, and I would make sure to describe these monsters as headless. And once the PCs defeat these drowned assassins, they can safely retrieve the skull and then return to the cabin to give it to Winifred. Now, when the PCs return to the cabin and give the skull to Winifred, she takes it and she holds it close. As soon as she does, she transforms in a flash of light to a rotted, tattered skeleton in rotten clothes, dripping with lake water, which collapses to the floor with a lifeless thud. Should the PCs search Winifred's corpse, they find a hat of disguise, along with 330 gold coins, which are curious in the sole respect that they don't seem to have a heads side. Both sides of each coin are tails. But, having exorcised Winifred's ghost, the PCs can now use the cabin as a place to take a long rest for the night. If they do, they of course enjoy the effects of a long rest, but again, their sleep is troubled by nightmares of being chased by floating, disembodied heads, as well as hearing the thunderous clatter of hoofbeats on the road. Either way, the PCs proceed to level 10, and we go to Act 3. Now, in Act 3, the PCs are surprised on the roadside by a pair of death's head trees, each of which has a half dozen death's heads hanging from them like rotten fruit. I wouldn't let the PCs spot these ahead of time. I would like to run this encounter where they're on the road and they just now notice that to either side of them are one of these horrific, monstrous trees. The trees themselves do not move or attack except in their own direct defense from PC attacks, but they do sick all of their death's heads onto the PCs. Now, as the death's heads attack, they chant the refrain from Jack Prelutsky's poem. He rides upon the wind tonight, he rides upon the wind, galloping, galloping, galloping on, out of the great oblivion, galloping till the night is gone, he rides upon the wind tonight, he rides upon the wind. Regardless of the actual time, the sun begins to set as this battle begins. Halfway through the battle, it is already nightfall, and PCs can hear in the distance on the road the thunder of hoofbeats. They grow louder, and within a few rounds, the Headless Rider, a Dullahan, rides out of the darkness and attacks. He fights until defeated, and this monster in particular is fun to fight because he's got the Mythic trait. That means he's got a second form, or a second boss monster phase. Now, once the Headless Rider has been defeated, he and his mount collapse into skeletal remains, and those remains collapse into dust. The Ravenloft mists of the Shadowfell gather ahead and behind the PCs. Could this be the way out? Before the PCs decide what to do, however, Dennis, with a relief, takes off his protective metal scarf. When he does, his head rolls off of his shoulders, falls to the road, and he collapses and dies. If any of the PCs try the same thing, remove their scarves, the same thing happens to them too. They die as their head rolls off their shoulders. Surprise, it's a horror adventure, and the PCs are now cursed. Cursed to keep their scarves on forevermore, or else die from decapitation upon their removal. The PCs can enter the flanking fog banks as they wish, but they will never be the same again, not after their fatal visit to the Rider's Bridge. So that's our Rider's Bridge adventure. What do you think? Was it sufficiently spooky? Did you think it was unfair at the end, despite the foreshadowing? And you may have noticed that I didn't put an actual bridge in the Rider's Bridge domain. Would you have done that, and if so, how? Let me know in the comments. Thanks very much for watching. As always, don't forget to do the internet things, click like and subscribe, don't forget to hit the bell icon if you want notifications on new videos from this channel, and thanks!
Don't lose your head.